Hello everyone, and welcome back to Trail of Secret. I know many of you use these videos to relax and unwind, so before you settle in, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Let me know where you're watching from. I love hearing from all of you. Now let's dive into tonight's story number 1. It happened on a cold October night, one of those evenings when the wind whispers through the trees like a secret being passed between unseen forces. I was driving home from my sister's house, a good 2-hour journey through mostly deserted highways. There was something strangely peaceful about night drives, the rhythmic hum of the engine, the headlights carving a path through the darkness. But that night, peace was the last thing I found. About halfway through my drive, I noticed something odd. My fuel gauge, which had shown nearly half a tank when I started, was dipping dangerously close to empty. I frowned. That didn't make sense. My car wasn't new, but it wasn't a gas guzzler either. Had I really miscalculated that badly? I pulled up my GPS, searching for the nearest gas station. The screen flickered for a moment before listing one about 10 miles ahead. I had just enough fuel to make it, so I kept driving, my unease growing with every mile. As I neared the station, my headlights caught something in the distance, a figure standing at the edge of the road. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, maybe a sign or a tree that looked vaguely human. But as I got closer, I realized it was neither. It was a man, standing motionless on the shoulder, facing my car. His clothes were tattered, his skin pale and almost waxy under the glare of my headlights, but it was his eyes that sent a chill down my spine. They were wide, unblinking, reflecting the light in an unnatural way. My gut told me to keep driving, to ignore him. But as I passed, he did something that made my breath catch in my throat. He smiled. Not a friendly smile. Not even a sinister grin. It was a slow, deliberate stretch of the lips. Too wide, too forced. Like he was mimicking an expression he didn't quite understand. My hands tightened on the wheel as I sped past him, my heart hammering in my chest. I glanced in the rearview mirror, expecting to see him fading into the distance. He was still there, but he had turned to face me, and he was walking. I swallowed, hard, forcing myself to focus on the road. I wasn't going to let my imagination get the better of me. I just needed gas. Once I filled up, I could get out of here and put this whole eerie encounter behind me. The gas station was old and barely lit, the neon sign above it flickering weakly. A single pump stood beneath a rusting canopy, and behind it, a tiny convenience store with a fogged-up glass door. I pulled in, shutting off the engine. The place was completely deserted, no attendant in sight. Stepping out, I shivered. The air was unnaturally still. No crickets, no wind, just silence. I inserted my card into the pump, but the screen blinked with an error message. Great. I'd have to go inside. The moment I opened the door, a small bell jingled above me. The store smelled of dust and stale air. Shelves stood half-stocked with faded snack packages, and an old radio crackled behind the counter. But there was no one there. Hello? My voice sounded too loud in the stillness. No response. Then I noticed something strange. The security monitor behind the counter was on, displaying grainy black and white footage of the gas station. My car was clearly visible. So was the pump. So was the man. He was standing just behind my car, still as a statue, staring directly at the camera. My blood turned to ice. I spun around, my breath hitching, expecting him to be right outside. But when I looked through the dirty glass door, there was nothing there. The lot was empty. My hands trembled as I turned back to the monitor. The image flickered, static distorting the screen, and then he was closer, a few feet from the back of my car. I swallowed, my heart hammering against my ribs. Then the screen glitched again, and he was right at the store's entrance. The bell above the door jingled. I didn't wait. I bolted towards the storage room at the back, slamming the door shut and locking it. My breath came in ragged gasps as I pressed my ear to the wood, listening. Silence. Then, footsteps. Slow, deliberate, moving past the counter. I clamped a hand over my mouth, trying to stay as quiet as possible. The steps stopped just outside the storage room door. I could hear breathing, shallow, raspy, almost mechanical. Then the doorknob turned. I braced myself, heart pounding. But the door didn't open. Instead, a whisper slithered through the crack between the door and the floor. "You left me." I bit back a scream, squeezing my eyes shut. What the hell did that mean? I had never seen him before in my life. My fingers trembled as I fumbled for my phone. No signal. Then, just as suddenly as they had come, the footsteps retreated. The bell above the door jingled again. I counted to 30 before daring to crack the door open. The store was empty. The monitors now showed only static. I didn't waste another second. I sprinted to my car, jammed the key into the ignition, and peeled out of the lot without looking back. For the next 20 miles, I checked my rearview mirror constantly. The road remained empty. No sign of him. No glowing eyes. Just darkness. By the time I reached home, I convinced myself it had been a hallucination, a trick of exhaustion. But just as I locked my door and let out a shaky breath, my phone vibrated in my pocket. A new notification, one unread message. No number, no contact. Name, just 2 words, see you. Story number 2. It was a cold November night when I first saw it. I was driving down an empty stretch of highway, the kind where the road seems endless, disappearing into the darkness. The air was crisp, the stars faint behind thick, rolling clouds. The hum of my car's engine was the only sound in the silence, aside from the occasional rustling of dry leaves caught in the wind. I had been on the road for hours, heading home from a business trip in a small town I'd never visited before. My GPS had glitched an hour ago, leaving me to rely on the occasional road signs and my gut instinct. The nearest gas station had been miles behind me, and I hadn't seen another car in what felt like forever. That's when I saw the sign, Hollow Creek, 12 miles. I didn't remember seeing this town on the map when I planned my route, but exhaustion was setting in and I needed a break. Maybe they had a motel where I could rest for a few hours before continuing my drive. I took the turnoff, the road narrowing, as I entered what felt like an endless tunnel of trees. The deeper I drove, the thicker the fog became, curling like ghostly fingers around the edges of my windshield. My headlights barely cut through it, and my fingers tightened on the steering wheel. Something about the air felt wrong. It was heavy, charged with an unsettling stillness, like the world was holding its breath. Then, I saw her, a woman standing on the side of the road, her dress flowing in the windless night. Her long, dark hair covered part of her face, her posture unnervingly stiff. I instinctively slowed down. She wasn't waving for help, wasn't trying to flag me down. She just stood there, staring at me as I approached. I hesitated, torn between stopping and speeding up. My instincts screamed at me to keep driving. But what if she needed help? What if she had been in an accident? I rolled down the window slightly. "Are you okay? Do you need a ride?" For a long moment, she didn't respond. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "Turn back." A shiver ran down my spine. "What?" She finally turned her face fully toward me. Her skin was pale, her eyes dark hollows, filled with something I couldn't quite place. Fear? Desperation? "Please," she whispered. "Turn back before they see you." I glanced around, suddenly hyper-aware of the dense trees surrounding us. "Who?" She took a step back, her gaze darting toward the darkness beyond the road. "They're already watching." Before I could react, she vanished. Not into the trees, not down the road. One second she was there, and the next, she wasn't. Breath hitched. My mind raced for a logical explanation, but none came. My gut screamed at me to leave. I slammed my foot on the gas, heart pounding as my car sped forward, tires screeching against the asphalt. I kept driving, my knuckles white, against the steering wheel. The town had to be close. Maybe I could find someone, tell them what I had seen, maybe. Then I saw the lights, dim, flickering orbs floating between the trees, moving too fast to be fireflies, too erratic to be headlights. They bobbed and weaved, closing in on the road ahead. My chest tightened, as I realized they weren't just lights. They were eyes, and they were getting closer. My breathing turned shallow. The fog thickened, swallowing the road behind me. The engine roared as I pressed the gas pedal harder. The trees blurred past, their shadows stretching like skeletal hands reaching for my car. The road twisted unexpectedly, and I barely managed to swerve in time. My tires skidded against the pavement, the car jerking violently as I struggled for control. Then, I saw it, a figure standing in the middle of the road. It was tall, impossibly tall, its limbs elongated, its posture wrong. Its head snapped toward me with a sickening crack. Those glowing eyes locked onto mine, and in that moment I felt something I had never felt before. Pure, unfiltered terror. I yanked the wheel, barely avoiding the thing as my car veered off the road. The last thing I saw before I crashed was that thing lunging forward, its mouth opening wider than any humans ever should. I woke up to silence. The car was wrecked, my head pounding. The windshield was cracked and my hands trembled as I reached for my phone. No signal. I forced myself to move, pain shooting through my body. The road was empty. No figures. No eyes. Only the endless forest and the unsettling quiet. Then, in the distance, I saw the sign. Welcome to Hollow Creek. The town wasn't on the map, and I was already inside it. Story number 3. It was a quiet night when I found myself driving along a lonely highway, the kind where the road stretches endlessly into the dark. The hum of my car's engine was the only sound accompanying me, apart from the occasional whisper of wind against the windows. I had always loved night drives. Something about the isolation and the stillness had a way of calming me. But that night something felt off. It started with a sense of unease, like I wasn't alone. I kept glancing at my rearview mirror, expecting to see headlights behind me, but the road was empty. I shook off the feeling, blaming it on the exhaustion, creeping into my bones after a long day at work. Then I saw her, a lone figure standing by the side of the road. The dim glow of my headlights barely illuminated her form, but she was there, motionless, her head slightly tilted downward as if she were deep in thought. Something in me hesitated. Stopping for strangers at night wasn't exactly safe, but there was something unsettling about the way she stood there, as though she had been waiting for me. I slowed the car to a crawl, rolling down my window just enough to call out. "Hey, are you okay?" She lifted her head slowly, revealing a pale face, her dark hair hanging limply around her shoulders. Her eyes met mine, wide, desperate. "Please," she whispered. "I need a ride." A chill crept down my spine. Every instinct told me to drive away, to pretend I hadn't seen her. But something in her expression made me pause. What if she was in danger? What if she had been stranded out here for hours? Against my better judgment, I unlocked the door. She slipped into the passenger seat without a word, her body tense. The air inside the car felt colder with her presence, and I resisted the urge to shiver. "Where are you headed?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She hesitated. Just drive." I frowned, but did as she said, guiding the car back onto the road. Silence settled between us, thick and heavy. I glanced at her from the corner of my eye. Her clothes were slightly damp, as though she had been standing in the rain, though the night was dry. Her fingers trembled where they rested on her lap. After a few minutes, I cleared my throat. "So what happened? Car trouble?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she turned her head slightly, staring out the window. "They left me." Knot formed in my stomach. "Who?" She took a shaky breath. "I don't know, I don't remember." Something about her voice made the hairs on my arm stand on end. I tried to brush off the unease, focusing on the road ahead. The highway stretched on, lined with dense trees that seemed to press in on us. It was only then that I realized something strange. The road signs had vanished. I hadn't taken a wrong turn, I was sure of it. But there were no mile markers, no gas stations, no signs of civilization. Just endless asphalt disappearing into darkness. A sinking feeling settled in my gut. "Do you know this area?" I asked, hoping she'd have an answer. Her fingers tightened around the fabric of her skirt. No. I exhaled slowly, trying to suppress my growing anxiety. Okay. Well, I'll keep driving until we find a town or something. Silence again. But this time it felt heavier. Then I heard it, a faint rhythmic tapping. At first I thought it was my tires against the pavement, but then I realized it was coming from inside the car. I glanced at her hands. They were still. Her feet weren't moving. The sound was coming from the back seat. My grip on the wheel tightened. My mouth felt dry. Slowly, I adjusted the rearview mirror, and my blood turned to ice. A shadowed figure sat in the back seat, motionless. Their face was obscured, but I could feel their gaze burning into me. I slammed the brakes. The car screeched to a stop, my heart pounding. I twisted in my seat, ready to confront whatever, or whoever was there. But the back seat was empty. I turned, back to the girl, my breath uneven. Who else is in this car? Her lips parted, but no sound came out. Her eyes were wide, terrified. I didn't wait for an answer. My hands shook as I pressed the gas, speeding down the highway. My mind raced. Had I imagined it? Was exhaustion playing tricks on me? Then, she whispered, barely audible over the sound of the engine. They found me. A chill ran through my veins. Who? I demanded. Who found you? She slowly turned her head toward me. Her face was pale, her expression unreadable, but her eyes held a deep, hollow sadness. You should never have stopped, she said. The car jolted suddenly, as though something massive had slammed into it. I struggled to keep control, my hands gripping the wheel with white-knuckled force. The tapping sound returned, louder this time, relentless. It was coming from all around us, like unseen hands knocking against the windows, the doors, the roof. Panic clawed at my throat. The girl remained still, staring straight ahead. Drive faster, she murmured. I obeyed, pressing the pedal to the floor. The car roared forward, the speedometer climbing higher and higher. The trees blurred past, their shapes distorting in the darkness. Shadows flickered at the edges of my vision, darting between the trees, keeping pace with us. Then I saw the lights. Ahead, a motel sign, flickering weakly in the night. Relief flooded through me as I veered toward it, pulling into the gravel parking lot. I barely threw the car into park before turning to her. We need to... She was gone. The passenger seat was empty, the door still locked. My heart pounded against my ribs as I scanned the lot, but there was no sign of her. And then I noticed something else. The car was old, dusty, worn down. The seats were torn, the dashboard cracked. My hands trembled as I reached for my phone, but the screen was black. No power, no signal. I stumbled out of the car, my breath coming in short gasps. The air was thick, suffocating. I turned toward the motel, hoping for answers. The sign above flickered weakly. Motel Redwood, vacancy. And beneath it, barely visible, a faded notice. In memory of the lost, do not stop for her. She belongs to the road. The word sent a jolt of horror through me. I turned back to the car, my mind racing. The passenger door was open, and in the distance, down that endless stretch of road, I saw her standing once more, waiting for the next traveler to stop. Story number 4. It was a cold, moonless night when Daniel boarded the last bus of the evening. He had missed his earlier ride home after staying late at work, and now he was the only passenger in sight. The bus driver, an old man with weary eyes, barely acknowledged him as he stepped inside. The doors hissed shut behind him, and the engine rumbled as the bus pulled away from the stop. Daniel found a seat near the middle, stretching his tired legs as he leaned against the window. Outside, the city lights flickered past, casting strange shadows on the empty streets. Something about the night felt different, too quiet, too still. He shook off the feeling, blaming it on exhaustion. A few minutes passed before he noticed something strange. The bus was taking a route he didn't recognize. He had taken this bus countless times before, but tonight, the streets looked unfamiliar. darker as if they belonged to a different part of the city. He leaned forward and caught the driver's gaze in the rearview mirror. "Excuse me, but isn't this supposed to go through Westbrook Avenue?" Daniel asked, trying to keep his voice steady. The driver didn't respond. His hands gripped the wheel tightly, his knuckles pale under the dim overhead lights. The bus continued down the unfamiliar road, the hum of the engine the only sound filling the space. Daniel's unease grew. He turned his head and scanned the seats behind him. What he saw made his breath hitch. He wasn't alone anymore. A row of passengers sat silently in the back of the bus. They hadn't been there when he boarded. They were all dressed in old-fashioned clothing, their faces pale and expressionless. Their eyes, hollow and dark, were fixed on him. A chill ran down his spine as he quickly looked away, his heart pounding. He reached for his phone, but there was no signal. The streetlights outside flickered before vanishing completely, plunging the bus into an eerie darkness. Daniel swallowed hard and forced himself to turn back towards the driver. "Sir, where are we going?" he demanded, his voice shaking. "This time," the driver spoke. His voice was low and gravelly, as if unused for years. "Last stop." Daniel felt his stomach drop. "What do you mean? This isn't the right route." The driver's eyes met his in the mirror, and for the first time, Daniel saw them clearly. They were completely black. Panic surged through him. He shot up from his seat and stumbled towards the door, gripping the metal bar tightly. "Let me out now," he shouted, banging on the doors. The passengers in the back remained silent, their lifeless stares never wavering. The bus suddenly lurched to a stop. The doors hissed open and a thick fog rolled in from the outside. Daniel hesitated, his breath quick and uneven. The road outside was shrouded in darkness. No buildings, no street signs, just an endless stretch of nothingness. The driver tilted his head. "If you want to leave, you can." Daniel took a step back, his instincts screaming at him not to go outside. He turned back to the passengers and saw, to his horror, that they were now standing. Their bodies were rigid, their heads tilted at unnatural angles. Their mouths opened, in unison, but no sound came out. Fear gripped him like a vice. He made a split-second decision and ran toward the back of the bus instead of stepping outside. The moment he moved, the passengers lunged at him, their hands outstretched, fingers bony and cold. Daniel barely managed to evade their grasp, scrambling to the emergency exit. He slammed his fist against the glass, but it didn't budge. The bus shuddered violently, the walls closing in around him. The shadows outside thickened, pressing against the windows, forming shapes that writhed and twisted. Then, everything went still. A soft whisper brushed against his ear. "You shouldn't have stayed on." Darkness swallowed him whole. The next morning, the city awoke as usual. The bus route had resumed its schedule unchanged. No one noticed the missing passenger. No one questioned the empty seat near the middle of the bus where Daniel's faint reflection still lingered on the window, staring out into the void. And every night, as the last bus rolls through the empty streets, a new passenger boards, unaware that they too might never reach their destination. Story number 5. It was a cold and misty evening when I found myself driving through a desolate stretch of road, cutting through the dense woods of Black Hollow. My hands tightened on the steering wheel as the fog thickened, swallowing the road ahead. The silence of the forest was deafening, interrupted only by the rhythmic thudding of my tires against the asphalt. I was headed to a cabin I had rented for the weekend, hoping to find solace in the solitude. I had driven this road many times before, but something about this night felt different. There was an unusual weight in the air, a suffocating presence that seemed to whisper just beyond my hearing. I turned up the radio, hoping to drown out the unease settling in my chest. Static, just white noise, hissing and crackling through the speakers. I twisted the knob, switching channels, but there was nothing, only the faintest of whispers hidden beneath the distortion. My pulse quickened as I stole a glance at the rearview mirror. The road behind me was shrouded in darkness, the fog swallowing my taillights as though the world was vanishing behind me. I forced myself to focus on the road ahead, dismissing the irrational fear creeping into my mind. Then I saw it, A figure stood on the shoulder of the road, barely visible through the mist. My headlights caught the shape of a person draped in a tattered cloak, their face obscured by the heavy hood. They stood motionless, staring in my direction. My foot hesitated over the brake, but instinct told me to keep driving. Something about that figure sent an icy chill down my spine. It wasn't just the way they stood, it was the way they felt, like they weren't supposed to be there. As I passed, I couldn't help but glance at the figure again. For a brief moment, as my car moved past them, I saw what lay beneath the hood. Hollow eyes, black as the void, staring right at me. My breath hitched, and I gripped the wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. I pressed down on the gas, eager to put as much distance between me and that figure as possible. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours. I struggled to shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that something was following me. I dared another glance at the rearview mirror. The figure was there, standing in the middle of the road, far behind me, but unmistakably there. No way they could have kept up with me. Not unless... I pushed the thought away. I was letting my imagination get the best of me. Just focus on the road, I told myself. The cabin wasn't far now. Then my headlights flickered. A cold dread curled around my spine as the dashboard lights dimmed for a brief second before returning to normal. My heart pounded as I pressed the accelerator harder. The road ahead was barely visible in the fog, but I knew I had to keep moving. A whisper brushed against my ear. I nearly jumped out of my seat. My hands trembled as I clutched the wheel, eyes scanning the darkness. The whisper hadn't come from the radio. It had been inside the car. Something moved in the back seat. My breath caught in my throat as I slowly turned my head. The rearview mirror reflected nothing but darkness, yet I could feel it. A presence. Watching. Waiting. I slammed my foot on the gas. The engine roared as I sped forward, my only thought to reach the cabin to get to safety. The fog seemed to grow thicker, swirling unnaturally around my car as if trying to swallow me whole. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the presence was gone. The fog thinned. My headlights illuminated the familiar dirt path leading up to the cabin. My hands shook as I pulled into the driveway, barely able to turn off the ignition before stumbling out of the car. I sucked in the cold night air, trying to calm my racing heart. I glanced back at the vehicle, half expecting to see a shadow lurking in the back seat, but there was nothing. Shaking off the lingering fear, I grabbed my bags and hurried inside, locking the door behind me. The warmth of the cabin did little to ease my nerves. Every shadow seemed to stretch and breathe, the whispers still echoing in my ears. I forced myself to believe I was safe. Just a trick of the fog, a mind overworked and tired. But deep down I knew the truth. Something had followed me, and it was still out there, waiting. Story number 6. It was a cold, foggy night when Daniel stepped onto the empty train platform. The air smelled of damp iron and old wood, and the dim yellow lights overhead flickered sporadically. He had missed the last train home and had no choice but to wait for the midnight express, a train he had never taken before. A single bench sat at the far end of the platform. Daniel sighed and made his way toward it, the sound of his footsteps echoing unnaturally in the silence. He glanced at his phone, 1% battery remaining. Great. He locked the screen and stuffed it into his pocket, leaning back against the bench and staring down the empty tracks. Moments passed, and then, ever so faintly, he heard something. A rhythmic tapping like fingers drumming on metal. He sat up, scanning the platform, but he was alone. The sound grew louder. A gust of wind swept through the station, carrying a distant whistle. Daniel turned just in time to see the Midnight Express emerge from the darkness, its massive steel body gliding toward the platform without a sound. It came to a stop, and with a hiss of air, the doors slid open. The train was eerily empty. Daniel hesitated before stepping inside. The interior was dimly lit, and the seats were old-fashioned, red velvet with brass handrails. The train smelled of dust and something faintly metallic. He chose a seat near the middle of the carriage, close to the window, and settled in for the ride. The doors slid shut and the train lurched forward, Outside, the fog grew denser, obscuring everything beyond the tracks. He turned to look down the carriage, hoping to see at least one other passenger, but the rows were empty. Then he saw it. A figure, seated at the far end of the carriage. Daniel hadn't noticed them when he first boarded, but now they were unmistakable. A man dressed in an old-fashioned suit sat motionless, his head tilted downward. His hands rested on his knees, fingers too long and too still. Daniel's throat went dry. He turned his gaze forward, trying to shake the creeping unease that coiled in his stomach. He told himself it was just another passenger, nothing more. But the silence was oppressive, and the rhythmic clatter of the train on the tracks did nothing to ease his nerves. Minutes passed. A voice crackled over the intercom. Next stop, black, hollow. Daniel frowned. There was no such station on this route. The train began to slow. He glanced at his phone. Dead. He looked out the window, but the fog was impenetrable. The train stopped with a soft jolt and the doors slid open. No one boarded. Then, slowly, the man at the end of the carriage stood up. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. The man turned, his face still obscured by shadows. Step by step, he began, walking toward Daniel, his movement unnaturally smooth, almost gliding. Daniel's fight-or-flight instinct screamed. He shot to his feet and stumbled toward the opposite door, frantically pressing the button to open it. Nothing happened. He banged against the metal, his heartbeat a frantic drum in his chest. Behind him, the footsteps stopped. Daniel turned his head just enough to see the man standing a few feet away. His face, if it could be called that, was hollow, a void where features should have been. And yet Daniel could feel it watching him. Then the train began moving again. The voice crackled over the intercom once more. Next stop, nowhere. Daniel's scream was swallowed by the darkness as the train hurtled forward, disappearing into the endless fog. Story number 7. It was supposed to be just another routine road trip, the kind where you roll down the windows, play your favorite music, and let the miles melt away. I had done it countless times before, driving long stretches of highway alone, the road my only companion. But this time was different. This time I would come face to face with something I still can't explain. It started with a gas station stop, the kind of place that barely looked open, its neon sign flickering in the night. The station sat alone on the edge of a wooded area, the trees swallowing the dim light that barely illuminated the cracked pavement. I needed gas, and more importantly, a break from the monotonous drive. As I stepped out, a strange silence hung in the air. No crickets, no rustling leaves, nothing but the occasional hum of the flickering sign above. A chill crawled up my spine, but I brushed it off as exhaustion. The attendant inside barely looked up as I paid, his expression unreadable, his eyes dull. Long drive, he muttered, finally breaking the silence. Yeah, just passing through. He nodded but said nothing more, sliding my change across the counter with fingers that looked unnaturally long. I grabbed my receipt and headed back to my car, eager to be on my way. But as I reached for the gas pump, I noticed something odd. Car parked at the farthest edge of the lot, its headlights off. It hadn't been there when I pulled in, I was sure of it. The windows were tinted and the vehicle sat perfectly still, as if waiting for something. I hurried through the fill-up, every nerve on edge. When I got back behind the wheel, I stole a glance at my rearview mirror. The car was still there. Still, unmoving, but I could feel it. Someone was watching me from inside. I forced myself to act normal, driving out of the station at a steady pace, resisting the urge to speed. But as I pulled onto the highway, I saw it. Headlights in my mirror. The same car. It followed at a distance, never getting too close, but never letting me out of its sight. I told myself it was just a coincidence, maybe another traveler heading in the same direction. But deep down, I knew better. After 20 minutes, I decided to test it. I switched lanes. So did they. I slowed down. They slowed too. I sped up, my heart pounding, and they matched my speed with terrifying precision. Now I knew. This wasn't just another driver. They were following me. I tried to stay calm, gripping the wheel tighter, my mind racing. Should I pull over? Call someone? But what would I even say? That a random car was driving behind me? That wasn't a crime. But then, the headlights disappeared. I blinked, confused. I hadn't seen an exit. There were no turns, no driveways. The road stretched endlessly in both directions, and yet the car was gone. I exhaled, a shaky laugh escaping my lips. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe exhaustion was playing tricks on me. I turned up the music, trying to shake off the lingering unease. And then, my radio cut out. Static filled the speakers, sharp and grating. I reached for the dial, but before I could adjust it, a voice crackled through. You shouldn't have stopped. My blood turned to ice. The voice was distorted, barely human. It sent a jolt of terror through me, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the volume knob. But no matter what I did, the voice continued. They know where you are now. The car lurched suddenly, the engine sputtering. My headlights flickered. The whole vehicle shuddered as if something massive had landed on the roof. My heart hammered as I slammed the accelerator, desperate to outrun whatever was happening. And then I saw them, figures emerging from the trees, tall and unnaturally thin. Their eyes glowed, reflecting the dim moonlight. Their limbs moved in a jerky, unnatural manner as if their bodies didn't quite understand how to function. They stepped onto the road ahead, blocking my path. I had no choice. I swerved violently, barely missing them as my tires screeched against the pavement. My breath came in ragged gasps, my pulse roaring in my ears. Whatever they weren't human. The radio crackled again and the voice returned. You can still escape, but you have to keep driving. No matter what happens, don't stop. I didn't need to be told twice. I drove through the night, the figures vanishing in my rearview mirror, but their presence still lingering. I didn't dare slow down, didn't dare look back. The further I got from that gas station, the lighter the air felt, the more normal the world seemed. By the time I reached a well-lit diner at the next town, I could finally breathe again. I pulled into the parking lot, my hands still shaking. As I sat there processing what had just happened, I don't know who they were. I don't know why they let me go. But I do know one thing. If you ever find yourself at a lonely gas station in the middle of nowhere, keep driving. No matter how low your fuel gets, because some stops are not meant for us. Story number 8. It started with an old book. I was wandering through a second-hand bookstore, the kind with creaky wooden floors and a faint scent of aged paper lingering in the air. I had no particular title in mind, just browsing, when I noticed a leather-bound tome resting on a forgotten shelf in the corner. Its cover was cracked and its spine barely held the pages together. No title, no author, just a dark, unassuming presence. Curiosity got the better of me, and I picked it up. The moment my fingers touched the cover, a strange chill ran down my spine. I dismissed it as a draft from the store's aging vents and took the book to the counter. The old man behind the register gave me an odd look as he rang up my purchase. That book's been here longer than I have, he muttered. Strange thing is, I don't remember anyone ever bringing it in. I chuckled, assuming it was just an old shopkeeper's attempt at adding mystique to his wares. I paid and left, the book tucked under my arm. If only I had known what I was taking home with me. That night I settled into my armchair with a warm cup of tea, ready to explore my find. The pages were filled with handwritten text, some in English, some in languages I couldn't recognize. The ink had faded in places, making it difficult to read. But one passage stood out, written in bold, dark strokes. Read aloud, and it shall awaken. Do not stop until the passage is complete. I assumed it was part of some elaborate story, a fictional warning to set the tone. Smiling to myself, I began reading the words out loud. The letters blurred as I spoke, the ink seeming to shift beneath my gaze. My voice wavered as the air around me grew thick, charged with something unseen. But I didn't stop. I was too intrigued. too caught up in the moment. The instant I finished the passage, the silence in my apartment became oppressive. The air pressed down on me, thick and suffocating. A faint whisper echoed from the darkness of the hallway. My breath hitched. I was alone. Or at least I had been. A shadow flickered in my peripheral vision. I turned sharply, my pulse hammering in my throat. Nothing. Just the dimly lit corners of my living room. I shook my head, trying to dismiss the creeping unease settling into my bones. Maybe I was just tired. Maybe the dim lighting was playing tricks on me. I closed the book, setting it aside, but the feeling of being watched didn't leave me. That night, sleep eluded me. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard it. The whispering. Low, unintelligible murmurs, like voices slipping through the cracks of reality. My bedroom door, which I had shut tightly, creaked open. A shadow loomed just beyond the threshold, darker than the night itself. My breath caught in my throat. I reached for my bedside lamp, but before I could turn it on, the door slammed shut on its own. Morning couldn't come fast enough. As soon as the sun's rays broke through my curtains, the oppressive atmosphere lifted. I convinced myself that it had all been my imagination, that the eerie book had simply played tricks on my tired mind. But I wasn't ready to test it again. I shoved the book into my closet, burying it beneath a pile of old clothes. Days passed. I avoided the book, refusing to even glance in its direction. But the whispers continued. They grew louder, more insistent, seeping into my waking hours. My reflection in the mirror would flicker, distorting into something unfamiliar. Doors creaked open when I turned my back, and the air in my apartment remained unnaturally cold, no matter how high I set the thermostat. Desperation drove me back to the bookstore. The old man looked up as I entered, his eyes dark with something I couldn't place. "I was wondering when you'd be back," he said, as if he had expected me. I placed the book on the counter. "What is this thing?" He sighed, tracing a finger over the worn leather cover. "It's not meant to be owned." I read from it. I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. His expression darkened. "Then you've invited it in." Chills ran down my spine. Invited what? Something that doesn't belong here. He leaned closer. "You need to get rid of it, burn it, but you have to do it right." He gave me specific instructions. A fire under, the open sky, a circle of salt around the flames, and most importantly, I had to finish reading the passage I had started before tossing the book into the fire. That night, I followed his instructions to the letter. I drove out to an abandoned field, a place where the city lights didn't reach. The wind howled as I poured a thick ring of salt around the firewood. My hands trembled as I pulled the book from my bag. It felt heavier than before, almost as if it resisted being destroyed. Taking a deep breath, I opened it to the passage I had read that first night. My voice wavered as I spoke the words again, the air growing thick around me. The whispers surged, screaming in protest. The moment the last word left my lips, I hurled the book into the fire. The flames roared, unnaturally high and bright. A shrill, inhuman wail pierced the air. Shadows twisted within the fire, writhing and contorting as if something inside was trying to escape. The ground beneath me trembled, and then, just as suddenly as it began, the fire died down to embers. The air cleared, the oppressive weight lifting. It was over. Or so I thought. Weeks passed in silence. No whispers, no flickering shadows, no eerie sensations. I finally felt like I had reclaimed my life. But then, one evening, a package arrived at my door. No return address, just a plain, unmarked box. My heart pounded as I tore it open. Inside, wrapped in aged parchment, was the same book, the same cracked leather cover, the same faded pages, and beneath it, a single note scrawled in familiar dark ink. "You can't get rid of me that easily." Story number 9. It was a late autumn evening, and the wind howled like a restless spirit through the trees. I had spent the day at my parents' cabin, nestled deep in the woods, helping them prepare for the colder months ahead. The sun had long since set, and as I drove down the lonely stretch of road back to my apartment, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The tall, skeletal trees lining the road seemed to close in, their bare branches clawing at the sky. I glanced at the clock on my dashboard, 11:47 p.m. The road was desolate, no other cars in sight. The silence, save for the hum of my engine, was unnerving. Just as I was about to turn up the radio to drown out my unease, my headlights caught something in the distance. A figure stood in the middle of the road. My heart lurched as I slammed the brakes, tires screeching against the asphalt. The figure didn't move. As my car skidded to a halt, the headlights illuminated a woman. She was barefoot, wearing a tattered white dress that barely reached her knees. Her long, matted hair partially obscured her face, but even from inside my car, I could tell something was deeply wrong. I hesitated, gripping the steering wheel tightly. I had heard too many stories, urban legends, real-life horrors, about people encountering strangers on deserted roads at night. I knew the safest option would be to lock my doors and drive around her. But something about the way she stood, motionless yet seemingly expectant, sent a shiver down my spine. Against my better judgment, I cracked the window slightly. "Are you okay?" I called out. The woman slowly turned her head toward me. Her eyes, hollow and unblinking, seemed to pierce straight through me. Then she lifted her arm and pointed to the forest behind her. I followed her gaze, my breath hitching as my headlights revealed the twisted silhouettes of the trees. "There's someone out there," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rustling wind. My stomach churned. "What do you mean?" She took a step closer to my car, her hand still trembling as it pointed toward the woods. "They're watching." I looked back at the trees, scanning for any sign of movement. The darkness was thick, almost suffocating, but something deep inside me, the same instinct that had screamed at me to keep driving, told me she wasn't lying. I turned back to the woman, but she was gone. My breath hitched as I scanned the area frantically. There was no trace of her, as if she had vanished into thin air. My hands were shaking as I locked the doors and pressed down on the accelerator, speeding away from the spot. But the unease didn't fade. My heart pounded as I checked my rearview mirror. For a split second, I thought I saw a shadow dart across the road behind me, but when I blinked, it was gone. I tried to rationalize what had happened. Maybe she had run off into the woods. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. But the dread that gnawed at my chest told me otherwise. By the time I reached my apartment, my nerves were shot. I locked every door, checked every window twice, and kept the lights on as I tried to sleep. But just as I started drifting off, a faint whisper echoed in my ears. "They're watching." My eyes shot open and my breath caught in my throat. The whisper hadn't come from my imagination. It had come from just outside my window. Story number 10. It was supposed to be a simple road trip. Just me, my best friend Daniel, and the open road stretching endlessly before us. We had planned this for months, escaping the monotony of work, responsibilities, and city life for a weekend adventure into the wilderness. The plan was to camp out at Black Hollow Forest, a place neither of us had been before but had read about online. People described it as serene, untouched by modern chaos, the perfect getaway. But there were also the stories, the strange tales of those who had gone in and never come back. We laughed at those stories, dismissing them as urban legends. If only we had taken them more seriously. The drive was smooth at first. The sun was beginning to set, casting golden hues over the rolling hills as we approached the tree line. The forest loomed ahead, a dense stretch of towering pines and thick undergrowth. The deeper we drove into the woods, the darker it became. The trees crowded the narrow road, their skeletal branches stretching overhead, forming a natural tunnel that swallowed the last of the daylight. An eerie silence settled in, the hum of the engine the only sound breaking the stillness. "You sure this is the right way?" Daniel asked, glancing at the map on his phone. "Yeah, it should be up ahead. Look for a turnoff to the left," I replied, my grip tightening on the wheel. But there was no turnoff. The road stretched on, winding deeper into the forest. The GPS signal flickered, then vanished altogether. Frustration crept in as we continued forward, searching for any sign of the campground. Then, we saw it. A figure standing in the middle of the road. I slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching as we skidded to a stop mere feet from the person. It was a woman, her clothes torn, her hair a tangled mess, and her skin pale as death. She didn't move, didn't react to the headlights blinding her. Her face was devoid of expression, her hollow eyes locked onto us with an unsettling intensity. Daniel swore under his breath. "What the hell?" I rolled down the window slightly. "Ma'am, are you okay? Do you need help?" She blinked, her lips parting as if she were about to speak, but no words came out. Instead, she lifted a trembling hand and pointed behind her, into the forest. My stomach twisted. Every instinct screamed at me to drive away, to leave her there, and forget we ever saw her. But something about the way she stood there, so lost and desperate, made it impossible to ignore. Daniel nudged my arm. "Dude, we should just go. This is too weird." But before I could respond, the woman suddenly gasped, her eyes widening in terror. Then she turned and bolted into the trees, disappearing into the darkness. A heavy silence followed. "Nope. Nope. Nope, nope." Daniel shook his head. "We are not going after her." I hesitated. What if she's in trouble? What if someone's chasing her? What if it's a trap? He countered. "Come on, man. You've seen horror movies. This is how people disappear." I exhaled sharply, my mind at war with itself. Finally, I made a decision. "Let's just check for a minute. We don't have to go far. If we don't see anything, we leave." Daniel groaned, but grabbed the flashlight from the glove compartment. "Fine. But if we die, I'm haunting you." We stepped into the forest, the air growing colder with every step. The light from the flashlight barely penetrated the thick foliage, casting eerie shadows that danced with our movements. The silence was oppressive, the only sound our cautious footsteps on the damp ground. Then, we heard it. A whisper. It was faint, almost indistinguishable from the rustling leaves. A hushed voice carried on the wind, murmuring words we couldn't understand. My breath hitched as I exchanged a nervous glance with Daniel. "Screw this," he muttered. "We need to go. Now." Before I could agree, something moved in the trees ahead. A shape, barely visible, shifting between the trunks. Then another. And another. Figures. Watching us. Their eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, reflecting the beam of our flashlight like predatory animals. They stood unnaturally still, their bodies barely discernible from the shadows. A deep, guttural sound rumbled from the darkness, something between a growl and a whisper. The air grew thick, suffocating, charged with an unspoken threat. We ran. Branches whipped at our faces as we tore through the undergrowth, our breaths ragged, hearts pounding. The whispering grew louder, swirling around us like a sinister lullaby. The figures moved too, gliding effortlessly through the trees, keeping pace with us. No matter how fast we ran, they remained just at the edge of our vision, closing in. Then the car came into view. We sprinted for it, fumbling for the keys as we practically dove inside. The engine roared to life, and I slammed the accelerator, tires kicking up dirt as we shot down the road. My hands trembled on the wheel, my mind racing to process what had just happened. But the forest wasn't done with us yet. The road seemed longer than before, stretching endlessly, looping in on itself. The trees blurred together, and no matter how far we drove, we never seemed to get any closer to the exit. The figures still lurked in the periphery, their glowing eyes a constant reminder that we were not alone. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. We burst through the tree line, the open highway appearing before us like a lifeline. The moment we crossed that threshold, the oppressive weight lifted. The whispers stopped. The figures vanished, and we were alone once more. We didn't speak for a long time. There was nothing to say. We had escaped, but at what cost? Later, when we checked the map, we realized something chilling. Black Hollow Forest didn't exist, at least not officially. There were no records of it, no mention on any map, no history of a campground. It was as if the place had never been there at all, But we knew the truth. We had been there, and something had been there with us. To this day, I don't know what we encountered that night, but sometimes when I close my eyes, I still hear the whispers, and I know, whatever they were, they're still out there, waiting for the next travelers to stumble into their domain. Story number 11. It was supposed to be a routine drive home. The night air was cool, the highway nearly deserted, and the hum of my engine was the only sound keeping me company. I had been working late, my mind preoccupied with spreadsheets and looming deadlines. But as I turned onto the familiar stretch of road leading through the dense forest, an unsettling feeling crept into my chest. The road ahead was shrouded in darkness, save for the dim glow of my headlights slicing through the void. The trees loomed like silent sentinels, their skeletal branches reaching toward the sky. I had driven this path countless times before, but tonight, something felt off. The air felt heavier, almost suffocating, and an inexplicable sense of dread gnawed at the back of my mind. I shook my head, trying to dismiss the unease. It was just exhaustion playing tricks on me. That was all. But as I glanced in the rearview mirror, my breath caught in my throat. A pair of headlights appeared out of nowhere, following me too closely. The vehicle hadn't been there a second ago, I was sure of it. My grip tightened on the steering wheel. The headlights were blindingly bright, flooding the interior of my car with an unnatural glow. I signaled to change lanes, hoping they would pass, but the car behind me matched my movements exactly. My pulse quickened. I sped up. They did too. A cold sweat formed on my brow. The logical part of my mind told me this was probably just some impatient driver tailgating me, but another part, a deeper, more instinctual part, screamed that something was very wrong. Then just as suddenly as they had appeared, the headlights vanished. I blinked, my foot hesitating on the gas pedal. The road behind me was empty again, stretching endlessly into the night. My hands trembled as I exhaled a shaky breath. I must have imagined it. I was too tired, too stressed. That was the only explanation. Shaking off the lingering fear, I focused on the road ahead. But no more than a mile later, my headlights caught movement on the side of the road. A figure was standing at the tree line, just barely illuminated by the dim glow. A woman. Her long, dark hair hung in tangled waves around her face, her pale skin stark against the shadows. She wore a white dress, tattered, dirt-streaked. She was watching me. A deep primal fear gripped me, but I couldn't look away. Her eyes, dark and hollow, locked onto mine through the windshield. For a split second, I thought I saw her lips move, forming silent words I couldn't hear. Then she stepped forward. My breath hitched as I swerved instinctively, my tires screeching against the asphalt. My car skidded to the side before I regained control, my heart hammering against my ribs. I glanced in the mirror, expecting to see her standing in the road, but she was gone. I pressed the accelerator harder, my only thought now to get home as quickly as possible. But the road stretched on endlessly, the trees blurring into an indistinct mass. My GPS flickered and glitched, the screen flashing an error message. That's when I noticed it. I had been driving for far too long. This road was supposed to lead straight to my town, a simple 15-minute drive. But I had been driving for nearly an hour, and there were no familiar landmarks, no signs, nothing but the endless road and the oppressive darkness pressing in around me. Panic clawed at my chest. I reached for my phone, but there was no signal. My hands were shaking now, my breath shallow. I wasn't alone. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming, suffocating. I risked another glance in the mirror, and my stomach dropped. She was in my backseat. The woman. Her hollow eyes bore into mine, her lips parting in a whisper I couldn't hear. I slammed on the brakes, my car screeching to a halt. My breath came in ragged gasps as I twisted around in my seat. The back seat was empty. I let out a choked, half-hysterical laugh. I was losing my mind. I had to be. Gathering my wits, I pressed the gas pedal again, my fingers gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I needed to keep moving. I needed to find a way home. But the road stretched on, and on. Time lost all meaning. Minutes bled into hours. My gas gauge impossibly remained at the same level. I was trapped in an endless loop, driving a road that had no end, and the worst part? I could see her. She stood on the side of the road, appearing every few miles, unmoving, watching, waiting. Each time she was a little closer. I couldn't take it anymore. I slammed my fists against the dashboard, my voice breaking as I shouted into the void. "What do you want?" Silence. Then, a whisper. Faint, almost imperceptible. Yet it slithered into my ears as if spoken directly into my mind. "You don't belong here." A sharp pain lanced through my head, a blinding white-hot agony that forced me to shut my eyes for a split second. And when I opened them, I was home. My car was parked in my driveway, my house standing before me like a beacon of normalcy. My hands trembled as I gripped the steering wheel, my breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. Had I imagined it all? Had I dozed off at the wheel and hallucinated the entire experience? No, because as I turned off the engine and stepped out of the car, something caught my eye in the reflection of my car's window. A single, dark handprint smudged against the glass. And in the distance, at the edge of the tree line, barely visible in the pale moonlight, she was still watching. Story number 12. It was a cold November night when I found myself driving down an unfamiliar stretch of road. The GPS had rerouted me due to an accident on the highway, leading me onto a winding path called Black Hollow Road. The name alone sent a slight shiver down my spine. The trees on either side of the road loomed high, their bare branches stretching out like skeletal fingers against the moonlit sky. My headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the cracked pavement and the occasional fallen leaf that tumbled across the road. I had been driving for nearly an hour without seeing another car. Something about the silence unsettled me. The air inside my car felt heavy, thick with an unspoken presence. Maybe it was just my imagination, but every so often I thought I saw movement in the trees. A shadow too tall, too still to be just. Another branch swaying in the wind. Just as I was about to shake off the feeling, my radio crackled to life. I hadn't been listening to anything, but suddenly static filled the car, followed by a faint whisper. It was so soft I almost thought I had imagined it. "Turn back." I swallowed hard, my fingers tightening on the steering wheel. The logical part of my mind told me it was just interference, a stray radio signal from some late-night broadcast. But deep down, something inside me stirred, a quiet, primal fear. I glanced at my phone. No service. Typical. I sighed, shaking my head. "Come on, get a grip," I muttered to myself. But as I continued down the road, that uneasy feeling only grew stronger. Then I saw her. A lone figure stood at the side of the road, barely illuminated by my headlights. A woman, dressed in a long white nightgown, her hair tangled and unkempt. She was barefoot, her skin pale against the darkness. Her head was tilted slightly to the side, her gaze fixed on me. I hit the brakes, my heart hammering. Every instinct screamed at me to keep driving. But what if she needed help? What if she had been in an accident, lost in the woods? I rolled down, my window just enough to call out, "Are you okay? Do you need help?" She didn't respond. She simply raised her arm and pointed down the road. I hesitated. Everything about this felt wrong. But against my better judgment, I slowly eased off the brake and continued forward. As I passed her, I stole one last glance in the rearview mirror. She was gone. A chill ran through me. There was nowhere for her to have gone. The trees were dense, and I hadn't heard a single step. I pressed my foot harder on the accelerator. I needed to get out of here. The road twisted and turned, seemingly endless. Then the fog rolled in. Thick and suffocating, it swallowed the road ahead, reducing my visibility to mere feet. My headlights barely cut through the dense mist. My fingers were white-knuckled on the wheel, my breaths shallow. And then I saw it. A house, old and decrepit, standing just off the road. Its windows were dark, empty void staring back at me. The wooden siding was worn, and the front door hung slightly ajar. The strange part, I hadn't noticed it on my GPS. I should have kept driving, but I didn't. Some invisible force compelled me to stop. I pulled onto the gravel driveway, my engine rumbling against the eerie silence. As I stepped out, the air grew colder, my breath visible in the dim light. The front door creaked as I pushed it open. The house smelled of damp wood and decay. The floorboards groaned under my weight as I stepped inside. Dust hung thick in the air, swirling in the faint moonlight filtering through the broken windows. Then the whispers started. Soft at first, barely audible. They slithered through the air like a distant echo, growing louder with each step I took. Turn back. I swallowed hard, my pulse racing. The rational side of me screamed to run, but something deeper, some sickening curiosity, kept me moving forward. Then I saw her again. The woman from the road stood at the top of the stairs, her vacant eyes locked onto mine. This time, she spoke. "You shouldn't have come." A sudden gust of wind slammed. The front door shut behind me, the sound reverberating through the empty house. Panic surged through me. I turned, grabbing at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. I was trapped. Footsteps echoed above me, slow, deliberate. I forced myself to turn back, my breath hitching in my throat. The woman was gone, but something else was there. A shadow, tall, impossibly thin, lingering just beyond the stairwell. Then, it moved. I didn't wait to see what it was. I bolted, my feet barely touching the ground as I sprinted toward the nearest window. Glass shattered as I hurled myself through it. Pain searing through my arms as I hit the cold, damp earth outside. I didn't stop running. Branches scratched at my skin as I tore through the woods, my breath ragged, my heart slamming against my ribs. Behind me, I could hear it, following, a guttural whisper slithering through the trees, growing closer. Then headlights, my car, my beautiful life-saving car. I didn't think twice. I dove into the driver's seat, slamming the door shut and fumbling with the keys. The engine roared, to life just as I saw it, standing at the edge of the trees, watching. The woman. Her lips parted, as if she were about to speak. But instead, she simply raised her hand and pointed once more. This time, behind me. I didn't dare look. I floored, the gas pedal, the tires screeching as I sped away, not daring to slow down until the road rejoined the highway. Only then did I glance in the rearview mirror. Black Hollow Road was gone, just an empty stretch of pavement surrounded by nothing but open fields. To this day, I don't know what happened that night. The road never appeared on any map, and no matter how many times I've tried to find it again, it simply doesn't exist. But sometimes on quiet nights I still hear the whispers. Story number 13. It was a bitterly cold evening when I found myself on an unfamiliar road, the sky a deep shade of violet as the last remnants of sunlight bled away. I had taken a wrong turn somewhere along the highway, my GPS struggling to reconnect as I drove through an endless stretch of wilderness. Towering pine trees lined the road, their skeletal branches reaching out like claws in the growing darkness. I wasn't particularly worried at first. I had always enjoyed night drives, the solitude of an empty road providing a strange sense of peace. But the further I drove, the more unsettled I became. The air seemed unnaturally still, the usual symphony of night creatures absent. Even my car's engine seemed quieter, swallowed by the vast silence around me. Then I saw it. A figure standing on the shoulder of the road illuminated by my headlights. A young girl, no older than 10, wearing a simple white dress. Her long black hair hung over her face, obscuring her features. I slowed down, my heart pounding. Stopping on a desolate road at night for a stranger, let alone a child, went against every instinct. But she stood so still, so unnaturally motionless, that I couldn't just drive past. I rolled down my window slightly. "Hey, are you okay? Do you need help?" She didn't respond. My fingers hovered over my phone, ready to call someone, anyone, for assistance. But before I could dial, She slowly lifted her head. Her eyes were solid black, not just dark, black. No whites, no irises, just endless voids that swallowed the light. A cold wave of terror crashed over me as every hair on my body stood on end. Then she smiled. It was a slow, deliberate motion, stretching her lips too wide, revealing rows of jagged, uneven teeth. I slammed my foot on the gas, my tires screeching against the pavement as I tore down the road. My hands were shaking, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I checked my rearview mirror, expecting to see her disappearing into the darkness. She wasn't there, but when I looked back at the road, she was standing in front of my car. I screamed, yanking the wheel to the side, barely avoiding her as my car veered onto the dirt shoulder. I struggled to regain control, my heart hammering against my ribs. This wasn't possible. No one could move that fast. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I just kept driving, my pulse a frantic drum in my ears. The road stretched on endlessly, my surroundings blurring together into an unrecognizable mass of trees and shadows. I had no idea where I was going, only that I needed to get as far away as possible. Then up ahead I saw lights. A small diner, its neon sign flickering weakly in the night. Salvation. I pulled into the parking lot, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. The interior of the diner was warm and dimly lit, a stark contrast to the chilling darkness outside. A few patrons sat scattered around, their faces buried in their meals. A waitress behind the counter glanced up as I stumbled in. "Rough night?" she asked, her voice tinged with amusement. I nodded, unable to form words. Sliding into a booth, I pulled out my phone, my fingers still trembling as I checked my location. My GPS was still useless, stuck on a loading screen. Frustrated, I looked up, hoping to ask for directions, but then my blood ran cold. Through the diner's large front window, I saw her, standing by my car, staring directly at me. I gasped, my breath catching in my throat. The waitress followed my gaze, her brows knitting together. "You see her too, don't you?" she asked quietly. I turned to her, my mouth dry. What is she?" The waitress exhaled, setting down the coffee pot she had been holding. "She's been around for years. No one knows where she came from, but once she sets her sights on you..." She trailed off, her expression grim. "She doesn't stop." I swallowed hard. "What do I do?" The waitress hesitated before leaning in. "You leave. Now. And you never look back." My body tensed. "Will that stop her?" She shook her head. "No, but it's your best chance." I didn't need to be told twice. Throwing a few bills onto the table, I rushed outside, my pulse pounding in my ears. The girl was gone. The parking lot was empty, my car sitting undisturbed under the flickering streetlight. I climbed in, locking the doors, my hands gripping the wheel. With one last glance at the diner, I sped away, determined to put as much distance between myself and whatever that thing was. The road stretched on, an endless abyss of darkness ahead. My breath was shallow, my muscles coiled with tension. Then, in the silence, a small voice came from the back seat. "You shouldn't have run,"